Greetings and welcome to this short video which is going to present the conclusions of the IBES workshop report on biodiversity and pandemics. This is presented in the context of agenda item 7A of the IBES 8 plenary on assessing knowledge in the context of the scoping report for thematic assessment of the interlinkages among biodiversity, water, food and health, also known as the Nexus assessment. And this workshop was convened in order to contribute to this scoping report. So the workshop itself was approved by the multidisciplinary expert panel and the Bureau of IBES in the context of the ongoing pandemics as a way to provide information on the links between biodiversity and pandemics, and as I just said, mainly to support the scoping process for the Nexus assessment. And there is additional information which is contained in information document number 5. So a little bit on the process that was followed to produce this workshop report. So first, once the Bureau and MEP approved the principle of a workshop, there was a call for nominations, and nominations were received. And the MEP, the Multidisciplinary Expert Panel, selected a group of experts in response to this call for nominations. They met virtually in July of 2020, and the draft was the object first of a series of internal review and then external review, which included comments provided by governments as well as by peers. The workshop report cites about 700 scientific publications. It was released at a media conference on the 29th of October 2020. And it's important to recall that this is a workshop report, and as such, it contains a disclaimer which says that the report and any of the recommendations or conclusion therein have not been reviewed, endorsed, or approved by the IBES plenary. They therefore represent only the views of the experts who were selected to draft that report. So with this, I conclude my little introduction, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Dazak from the EcoHealth Alliance. Peter was the chair of this workshop report, and he's going to share with us some of the highlights of that report. Over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and it is a great pleasure to have this opportunity to tell you what our key findings were in this pandemic workshop. So one of the critical issues is we believe we'll need a significant fundamental shift in the way we approach pandemics as we build out of COVID. And really what we're talking about here is shifting from reacting to pandemics to preventing pandemics. And to deal with prevention of pandemics, we need to know where they come from and why they emerge, and we need to block it. Whereas our current strategy is to wait for them to emerge and try and control them. This is fundamentally different and transformative. Almost all modern pandemics are caused by what we call zoonoses, diseases that originate in animals. If we take COVID-19 as an example, it's pretty sure that the virus that causes it, SARS-CoV-2, originated in bats somewhere in Southeast Asia, as did SARS. We know that Ebola comes from wildlife. We know that influenza strains evolve as they shift between wild birds and domestic animals, pigs, and then get into people. So understanding that is very important. The linkage to biodiversity is critical. Biodiversity is where these viruses originate. It also provides the strategy to prevent them and the tools to prevent them. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we've looked at the underlying causes in the workshop of all pandemics. And what we find is that about 30% of emerging diseases are driven by land use change, deforestation, expansion of agricultural production that uses up pristine forest and converts it into agricultural settings. Another really big driver of modern emerging diseases is the wildlife trade, not just the wildlife trade that people rely on for consumption of food. We're talking about the unsustainable, almost industrial scale production of wildlife for fur, for other consumables that are really at an unsustainable rate around the planet. The amount of viruses present in the environment is quite staggering. We estimate around 1.7 million unknown viruses are present in animals around the world that haven't yet been discovered. And probably 600,000 or more of those are going to be able to infect people. So there's a very significant future threat of pandemics. And as we encroach further and further into wildlife habitat, cutting down forests, building roads into pristine areas, sending people in there with no significant food supply, so they have to go out and hunt wildlife for food, or culturing animals in a way that's unsustainable, we're going to drive the future emergence of more and more pandemics. In fact, they're accelerating over time. We estimate about 5 new diseases emerge every year. That's not something that we can sustain on this planet. So how can we deal with this? And what we did in the pandemic workshop is to really look at policy options and put them forward as potential ways we can deal with prevention. One of the really big findings is that there isn't on the planet a pandemic prevention strategy. Most strategies to deal with pandemics involve preparing for them and responding to them after they emerge, building up stockpiles of vaccines and drugs. Well, what we're proposing is that an intergovernmental council on the prevention of pandemics would be a critical new transformative change, a policy relevant organization that provides scientific information on disease emergence, coordinates a monitoring system to look at the drivers and the outcomes of those drivers, and builds a One Health approach, One Health being the connection between wildlife health, ecosystem health, and human health. And really importantly, that if this is driven by economic development, essentially, by our economic footprint around the world, our environmental footprint, then why don't we incorporate into our planning strategies for development, big development projects, some sort of pandemic risk framework, and factor in the cost of pandemics into the future. And I'll show you in a minute that that cost is very significant. And essentially the policy implications of what we found are that business as usual does not work. We saw that with COVID. We saw that in the 1 year plus that we wait for a vaccine. And now, even now, many countries around the world do not have an adequate vaccine supply. And the uptake in many of the richer countries is still not adequate. As we wait for a vaccine, millions of people die. Millions of people get infected. Our global economy crashes. And this especially has an impact in countries that already had less resources to deal with pandemics in the first place. So there are big equity gaps in the way COVID is impacting people around the world, and that will continue. But I think that the economic argument is important. Let's look at those trillions of dollars that we all know have already been lost to the global economy. If you look back over the last few years at emerging diseases, most of them zoonotic, and look at the sort of economic damages that they've caused, we see really significant impacts, billions of dollars from SARS, where just a few hundred people were affected, $30 to $50 billion in global economic loss. With Ebola in West Africa, over $30 billion in a crashed economy for 3 countries and the complete lockdown of those countries for trade and travel. But look at the large black circle that's sort of encroaching from the right of your screen. That's COVID-19, with total estimated damages already in the multiple tens of trillions of dollars. These diseases have such a significant impact. It's quite striking that there isn't already a prevention strategy at a global scale to deal with them. So what would that prevention strategy do in terms of return on investment? How much would it cost and what would we get back? Well, we do have some clues to this, and the pandemic report lays that out. We know that zoonoses, if you average them out over the last 100 years, probably cost around $1 trillion a year in economic damages. But just dealing with those two big drivers, the wildlife trade that's unsustainable and unsustainable land use change, to the tune of $20 to $30 billion annually, we could get a return on investment that's 2 orders of magnitude greater. And I think that's really significant and a positive, optimistic message. And finally, if we do the things that we need to do to prevent pandemics, we not only improve our health conditions in the future, we also preserve biodiversity and the critical ecosystem services we obtain from that, and we reduce the impact of climate change. So there are really 3 big wins for a prevention strategy for pandemics that I hope we're all going to get together and lead forwards. Thank you very much.